A heavily tattooed man paces inside a prison cell, waiting for his release. A photo on the wall shows him with an unfamiliar young man. Eventually, the guards arrive, leading him out as he's introduced to the audience simply as the driver. A prison worker gives him a final piece of advice and hands him a business card, offering help if he ever finds himself in trouble on the outside.
You get to thinking it's too much. You can't handle the pressure.
But the driver has only one question.
Where's the exit?
As soon as he steps beyond the prison gates, he tosses the card away without hesitation and starts walking, stretching his legs after years of confinement. Following a long trek along the highway, he finally arrives at a junkyard where his sleek Chevrolet Chevelle muscle car has been waiting for him. The keys are tucked under the front wheel just as planned. With a quick motion, he pulls the cover off the car, starts the engine without hesitation, and speeds off, setting his sights on his first target. Everything he needs to know is stored in the glove compartment. Beneath the seat, he also finds a revolver. Traffic laws weren't exactly part of the prison curriculum, so when he reaches his destination, he parks without a second thought, stepping directly into oncoming traffic as irritated drivers honk and shout. Unbothered, he makes his way into an office building, wasting no time in searching for a specific employee. Before the man even has time to react, the driver pulls the trigger. Job done. As he leaves, he notices a surveillance camera. His actions are already on record. Meanwhile, in a roadside motel, a man inside a bathroom tries to buy from a dealer. He pulls out a handful of crumpled change, but the dealer isn't interested in charity cases. After a brief argument, the buyer convinces the dealer to make the sale anyway. He pockets his purchase and heads back to his car. Back at the crime scene in the office, the place is swarming with cops. Among them is the same drug buyer from the motel, now seen in his actual role, a police officer. His arrival isn't exactly met with enthusiasm, especially by a female detective who seems disgusted by him. She snuffs out his cigarette in his own cup of coffee. The detective and the cop are soon introduced as reluctant partners, just as the case of the murdered office worker lands in their laps. The cop isn't thrilled about the assignment. Meanwhile, the driver arrives at a small office where two men are watching news coverage of the very murder he just committed. One of them, seated at a desk, greets the driver with a smirk, calling him,
"You've been a bad boy."
The conversation shifts to business. The driver hands over a stack of cash, paying for the car that had been left for him. With that settled, he asks for the names of the remaining accomplices responsible for his brother's death. But getting information after a decade in prison comes at a price. The informant casually mentions,
"The price just went up."
The driver isn't happy with this sudden inflation, but before he can protest,
"The price just went down."
the informant makes a move. He signals his bodyguard, a former MMA champion from Samoa, to step in and handle the situation. But the moment the fighter sees the driver's tattoo, his entire demeanor changes. Panic sets in as he recognizes the man standing before him.
"I know who you are." "Who is it?"
Calling him a ghost before turning tail
"Can't mess with no ghost."
and fleeing the room. Left alone with the driver, the informant suddenly becomes much more cooperative. Not only does he hand over the requested information, but he also throws in a small compensation, hoping to smooth things over. Meanwhile, at the police station, the detective, named Cicero, and her new partner analyze the security footage from the office, watching the execution-style murder unfold. The pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together. As the detectives review the security footage, they notice something crucial. The killer and the office clerk clearly knew each other. Before they can analyze further, the cop's phone rings. His child's mother calls to demand that he take their kid to baseball practice, then abruptly hangs up, leaving him no room for negotiation. While the authorities try to piece together the crime, the driver is already heading toward his next target. A new character enters the scene. His name is the Killer. He lives in a luxurious home, surrounded by wealth and an equally stunning woman. Unlike most hitmen, he seems more invested in self-improvement than blending into the shadows. His home is decorated with framed magazine covers featuring his face, evidence of a man who takes pride in his image and success. Despite his near-perfect physique, it's revealed that he had leg issues as a child, something he fought hard to overcome. His morning routine includes an intense yoga session, bordering on breakdancing, showing off his flexibility and discipline. After his workout, he wakes his partner and joins her outside for a conversation. He tells her that yoga has become too easy. He craves something more extreme. His demeanor is almost too upbeat for a contract killer, but it doesn't stop him from getting a new assignment. A message comes through with a photo of the target, the driver. Without hesitation, the killer prepares for the job, collecting his weapons and heading out in one of his high-performance sports cars. Just before leaving, he runs back to give his lover one final kiss. Before setting off, the killer checks in with his therapist, talking about how the work is starting to exhaust him.
My edge.
Well, you still haven't told me what it is you actually...
However, he keeps his true profession a secret, posing as a surgeon who removes tumors. The therapist remains skeptical, but continues the session over the phone as he begins tracking an elderly man. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Cicero examines a photo of the driver's tattoo. Sergeant Mallory, noticing her frustration, apologizes for pairing her with her current partner, but insists that she let him do his job, no matter how unconventional his methods may be. After speaking with her superior, Cicero approaches the cop, showing him a photo of the killer, identified through surveillance footage and information from the prison warden. The cop chuckles at the sight of the driver, recognizing him instantly. It turns out the driver wasn't just another inmate. He ran a smuggling operation inside the prison. Cicero fills in the gaps, revealing that he had been arrested 10 years ago for his role as the getaway driver in a bank heist. The story flashes back to that very robbery. The driver and his crew executed a flawless escape, weaving through traffic, outmaneuvering the police with expert-level reverse driving, a technique so precise that the cops had no way to counter it. While Cicero continues briefing the officers on the case, the focus shifts beak to the elderly man being monitored by the killer. The old man returns to his apartment with a much younger woman who helps him carry groceries. Inside, he persistently offers her a drink, urging her to stay longer. Just as the conversation unfolds, the driver arrives, pulling up outside the building. The killer, still on the phone with his therapist, ends the call and begins preparing his weapon. Before hanging up, he casually mentions something personal. He plans to propose to his girlfriend. He also admits that he has stopped taking his medication, prompting a warning from his therapist. Ignoring the concern, he ends the conversation, stepping out of the car with only one focus, his next target. The driver steps out of his car and moves toward the old man's apartment. Behind him, the killer follows, silently slipping through the same entrance. Inside, the elderly man, who is far from the harmless figure he appears to be, is busy drugging his caretaker, waiting for her to pass out. The story flashes back to a grainy video recording, one that Detective Cicero and the cop are currently reviewing. The footage,
They got ambushed by another crew. Somebody set them up.
filmed on a shaky handheld camera, reveals a scene from 10 years ago. The driver and his younger brother being held hostage by a group of armed criminals. The brother, terrified but resolute, begs the driver not to reveal where the stolen money is hidden. If they talk, he warns, they won't make it out alive. Their captors confirm his fears, revealing that the rest of their crew has already been executed. As the driver hesitates, torn between his brother's plea and his own fear, the kidnappers crank up the pressure. A gunshot rings out, fired close enough to their heads to make their ears ring. More threats follow, the tension mounting. The driver finally breaks. He reveals the location of the stolen money.
It's under the floorboards in the kitchen.
The moment the words leave his mouth, one of the kidnappers slashes his brother's throat without hesitation. A few of the gangsters seem uneasy about the needless execution, but the majority couldn't care less. The entire event is caught on camera by none other than the old man currently being hunted. The flashback fades, pulling the story back to the present, where the driver kicks in the old man's door, shattering it into splinters. The sudden entrance interrupts whatever sick plan was about to unfold. The aging gangster tries to talk his way out of it, insisting that he was forced to kill the driver's brother by someone higher up the chain. The excuse earns him nothing but 2 bullets. With the old man dealt with, the driver leaves the terrified caretaker behind and bolts into the hallway. Waiting for him is the killer. Before the contract killer can act, a little girl suddenly runs into the hallway, momentarily blocking the shot. The killer shoves her into a nearby room to get her out of harm's way, but by the time he refocuses, the driver has already drawn his weapon. A firefight erupts. The driver doesn't aim to kill, but he pins the killer down, forcing him into cover. Using the momentary advantage, he makes his escape. By the time the killer rushes to the window, the Chevy Chevelle is already speeding off, tires burning against the asphalt as it disappears into the distance. The flashback resumes, revealing the full story. Moments after his brother's murder, the driver himself was shot in the head, a bullet tearing through the back of his skull. But before losing consciousness, he made a promise.
I'm gonna kill you all.
Somehow, against all odds, he survived. In the hospital, doctors rebuilt his skull with a metal plate, unknowingly giving him the strength to carry out his promise. Meanwhile, at home, the cop arrives late to pick up his son. His child's mother, already furious, lashes out at him for always putting his job first. He tries to explain that this case is serious, but she doesn't care. Fed up, she threatens to strip him of his parental rights if he doesn't step up. With no choice, the cop rushes Tommy to his baseball game, attempting to smooth things over with his neglected son. As they drive, Tommy quietly admits that he doesn't even like baseball. He barely gets off the bench. His father, feeling guilty, promises to talk to the coach. But before he can follow through, his phone buzzes. It's Cicero. The case demands his attention. A fresh crime scene needs investigating. Tommy immediately deflates, knowing what's coming. But instead of admitting he has to leave, the cop pretends everything is fine, acting as if he'll stay for the game. 30 minutes later, he shows up late to the crime scene, greeted by Cicero's unimpressed glare. The murdered old man is exposed as a notorious underground filmmaker, known for filming disturbing, illegal content. The cops also confirm that he was the one who filmed the execution of the driver's brother a decade ago. Adding to the chaos, they uncover evidence of a shootout, though the second shooter remains unidentified. Elsewhere, the killer sits in his hotel room, recounting his encounter with the driver to his fiancée. The mission wasn't as easy as he expected. His target is far more dangerous than he anticipated. The killer sat back, impressed.
He's pure, no hesitation.
His target had been anything but ordinary. The driver moved with a cold, calculated fearlessness, making him one of the toughest opponents he had ever faced. Rather than feeling frustrated by the failure, the killer admired the challenge. As he mulled over the encounter, an idea struck him. Why not propose over the phone? In his world, this seemed like a perfectly normal thing to do. Without hesitation, he asked Lily to marry him. On the other end of the line, she smiled,
Marry me.
already prepared to say yes. The next morning, back at the police station, Detective Cicero noticed something unusual, a tattoo on the cop's arm. After a bit of digging, she discovered that before his transfer, he had worked in the Los Angeles Homicide Division, a department notorious for its corruption and misconduct. It was during that time that he had met his ex-wife, Marina, not as a fellow officer, but as an informant. The revelation painted a picture of a man with a complicated past. As if that wasn't enough, Cicero also learned that the cop had been through rehab for substance abuse. Noticing her judgmental stare, the cop brushed it off, claiming that all of it was ancient history. He even lied, saying he had cleaned up his act the moment his son was born. Meanwhile, the driver set his sights on his next target, a woman. He watched her from his parked car, waiting for the right moment. When she stepped outside to see her son off, he made his move. Gun in hand, he entered her home. Inside, she was busy feeding an infant, completely unaware of his presence until he stepped closer. But something was off. The woman wasn't his target. She was his ex. The realization hit hard. For a decade, he had forbidden her from visiting him in prison. Now, standing before her, he assumed that the boy he had just seen was his son. He was wrong. His ex had moved on, building a new life without him. Worse, the child he had once believed was waiting for him had never even been born. She had terminated the pregnancy. The news devastated him. Silent, shattered, he turned and walked out, back to the mission that had consumed him. Behind him, his ex called out, saying she knew what he was doing, and despite everything, she wished him luck. While the driver was drowning in heartbreak, the killer was celebrating life. His wedding to Lily was nothing short of spectacular. Fast cars, an extravagant ceremony, and a touch of chaos. No traditional bouquet toss here. Instead, the couple indulged in their idea of romance, target practice with handguns, shooting bottles off a fence. The killer, now officially a married man, promised Lily that they would start fresh in Pasadena. He swore that his days as a hitman were over. At the same time, the cop found himself standing on Marina's doorstep, forcing his way into her world again. He was surprised to see that she had been following his case on the news,
I thought you didn't care about my case.
watching every development closely. Determined to fix things, he suggested starting over, but Marina wasn't interested. She had worked hard to create a better life for herself and her son. Desperate to convince her, he pulled out his secret stash of drugs and handed them over, promising to check himself into rehab. For real, this time. But there was one condition. He needed one more day. Just one day with her and his son before he disappeared back into his work. Marina hesitated, but didn't say no. Meanwhile, under the glow of neon lights, the driver arrived at his next destination, a strip club. From the shadows, he watched his next target, waiting for the right moment. The man he was after? The same enforcer who had slit his brother's throat. When the time was right, the driver followed him inside, tracking him down to the restroom. Inside, the past caught up with the present. The killer recognized him immediately. Before things escalated, an old doorman named Joe happened to be nearby. The driver calmly told him to walk away, to pretend he never saw anything, no matter who walked out of the bathroom alive. The old man didn't argue. He left, and the door locked behind him. A brutal knife fight erupted. Blades flashed in the dimly lit restroom as blood splattered across the tiles. The driver outmatched his opponent, cutting him down stroke by stroke until the enforcer collapsed, barely clinging to life. With his last breath, the dying man didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he asked for one thing: for the driver to call his son and tell him that his father was sorry. The driver didn't reply. He left his enemy bleeding out on the floor, walked outside, and sat in his car. There, in the silence of the night, he picked up his phone and made the call. Elsewhere, the killer sat alone on his couch, flipping through old photographs, reflecting on the life he had built and the one he had chosen to leave behind. As the killer flipped through old photographs, his expression changed when he reached the ones from his childhood. The memories of his scarred, damaged legs resurfaced, bringing back emotions he had buried long ago. Running his fingers over the faded scars, he seemed lost in thought. That moment of vulnerability quickly passed, replaced by restless energy. He grabbed his weapons and began meticulously cleaning them, his movements almost frantic. That was how Lily found him. She had been hoping that after everything, her husband would finally let this obsession go. But the killer had already made up his mind. He would finish what he started, and only after that would he leave this life behind. Lily pleaded with him to walk away now, but he remained steadfast, his hands never stopping as he worked on his weapons. Meanwhile, the cop woke up in bed next to his son. The boy admitted once again that he didn't really like baseball. His father reassured him that it was just a matter of practice, even admitting that he had never been particularly good at it himself. When he got up, he found Marina in the bathroom, her eyes glazed over. She confessed her fear of ending up in the hell they both had created, constantly hurting each other over and over again. For once, the cop didn't try to argue. Without hesitation, he took what remained of his stash and dumped it in the trash, then returned to bed, falling asleep beside her. The fourth day began with both the cop and the killer leaving their homes, each lost in their own thoughts. Cicero called, excited about a new lead. She had uncovered a connection. Both of the driver's victims had been police informants and had been involved in his brother's murder.
It's my case.
Ignoring Cicero's request, he chose to visit a different witness, the security guard from the strip club who had barely survived the knife fight. Even as his partner protested, the cop was firm. This was his investigation, and he would handle it his way. The driver, meanwhile, heard a breaking news report over the radio. His enemy from the strip club had survived and was recovering in the hospital. Without hesitation, he spun his car into a perfect 180-degree turn and sped toward the clinic, determined to finish what he started. At the same time, the killer received the same news from his employer. His client speculated that the driver would go after the survivor. A perfect opportunity to intercept him. The cop arrived at the hospital first, making his way inside. But the driver wasn't far behind. As expected, he stormed through the hospital without hesitation, heading straight for the operating room. Inside, a team of doctors was fighting to save the very man who had murdered his brother. That fight ended immediately. The driver fired multiple shots into his target's skull, ensuring there would be no more second chances. The sound of gunfire echoed through the halls, and within moments, the cop rushed out from a neighboring room, already in pursuit. The chase led them deep into the hospital's basement, where a gunfight erupted. For a brief moment, the driver got the upper hand, catching his opponent off guard. The cop was forced onto his knees, staring up at his attacker. But as soon as he closed his eyes, bracing for the worst, the driver disappeared. By the time the cop recovered, he could hear the roar of an engine outside, the Chevelle tearing away into the night. On the road, the driver's phone rang. On the other end, a child's voice spoke. It was the son of the man he had just executed, vowing revenge. The driver listened without emotion, then simply told the boy to do what he felt he had to, but to understand the consequences before making that choice. Before the conversation could continue, headlights appeared behind him. The killer had caught up. The high-speed pursuit didn't last long. Both men were too skilled to let it drag out. Shots were fired. The driver took a hit to the neck, but not before shooting out the killer's tire, forcing his pursuer to spin out as he disappeared once more into the darkness. Frustrated but unfazed, the killer received another unexpected call. His employer had canceled the contract. For a moment, the killer simply sat there, gripping the wheel.
No. No way, no way.
Then, with cold determination, he made a decision. He wasn't walking away. The hunt wasn't over. Meanwhile, the driver had a different destination in mind. Still bleeding, he arrived at the home of his brother's father, suspecting that he had been the one who sold them out after the heist. Instead, he found only his mother. His father had been dead for years, 3, maybe 4. With practiced hands, she stitched up her son's wound, her touch gentle despite everything. She reassured him that her husband had loved Gary, the driver's brother, and would have never betrayed him. Sitting there, the driver finally spoke about the past. He revealed that the bank robbery hadn't been about greed. It had been a desperate attempt to settle Gary's debts. He had stepped in because he couldn't let his brother face it alone. But in the end, the cost of loyalty had been higher than he ever imagined. Taking his brother's ashes, the driver heads to his next target. Along the way, he keeps thinking about who set up their crew. At the police station, the cop tells his partner about his encounter with the driver at the hospital and how he barely survived. Everyone around congratulates him on almost catching the criminal. Cicero forgives him for ignoring her call and shows him a possible list of the Avengers' targets. All of them are informants who served minimal sentences for serious crimes. The cop takes on the task of checking on the ones the driver hasn't reached yet. Meanwhile, the driver tracks down the last target on his list, a traveling preacher who speaks from a mobile church tent, someone he has been hearing on the radio throughout his journey.
There's not a man, woman, or child in this church today.
Upon arrival, he waits for the sermon to end before approaching the priest. The man tells the Avenger that he abandoned his criminal past long ago and now tries to guide as many people as possible onto the right path. He was the only one who didn't want the driver and his brother to be killed during the hostage situation. Before the preacher leaves for a walk, his wife and child come to see him. The driver hesitates upon seeing them, but he sticks to his plan. As they walk toward the shore, which is meant to be an execution ground for one of them, the two men talk. The preacher reveals that he is the father of 12 adopted children. He admits that in Gary's case, he was only supposed to be the lookout, collecting easy money. He confesses to what he did and regrets it. He took his share and went to prison, where he turned to God. The driver hesitates for a long time before finally forcing his target to his knees and preparing to shoot. At the last moment, he fires to the side, lets the man return to his family,
Go back to your family.
and walks back to the church tent. Inside, the killer is waiting, his gun raised. He doesn't rush to shoot. He wants a fair fight and recognition for his skills. The driver remains seated and calmly states that the killer has never done anything to him. He also tells him that he has deep-seated issues. The assassin grabs the gun from the driver and aims it at his head. Seeing the list lying nearby, he notes that one more name should be on it, the contractor who ordered the hit, but he doesn't say the name. A car door closes outside. The cop steps out and walks toward the tent, slowly approaching the driver from behind. He orders the killer to drop his weapon,
Put the gun down.
and the man complies under the threat of death. As soon as the gun lowers, a shot rings out. The cop fires a bullet into the back of the driver's head. He was the contractor all along, the one who tried to kill the driver the first time. He tells the killer that he decided to get involved when he saw that the assassin failed to kill his target at the old man's apartment. The killer points at the list and says that the driver never even knew the contractor existed. The cop admits that he realized this when the driver refused to shoot him in the hospital basement. It turns out that Gary's girlfriend was an informant for the detective. She was the one who betrayed the crew,
His brother's girlfriend was my informant down in L.A.
selling them out completely. The other informants working for the cop helped take the driver's crew's stolen money for themselves. After hearing this, the killer leaves the tent, but the cop catches up to him and tries to pay him for the job. The assassin, however, only ever charges $1 for his contracts, considering contract killing more of a hobby than a profession. Even so, he refuses to take the payment.
That's my price. Call it a hobby.
Technically, he didn't complete the job. Before leaving, he announces that he's done with this life, and the cop echoes his words. Cicero drives toward the crime scene, piecing together the bigger picture. All the informants involved in the case reported to one man, the cop. It finally clicks. Calling the station, she learns that he personally volunteered to take on this case, and at that moment, everything falls into place. Meanwhile, the cop calls his ex, telling her it's over. His voice is light, as if a weight has been lifted. He truly believes everything will be fine now, that life can finally start over. A gunshot to the back interrupts his thoughts. The steel plate in the driver's skull proved tougher than the bullet fired into it. The killer returns to his wife. Cicero arrives at the scene and finds the cop's lifeless body, but chooses not to reveal the truth about his past. As the sun sets, the driver scatters his brother's ashes over the reservoir before driving off toward the horizon. Back at the church, the preacher delivers a sermon about forgiveness. Fun fact, the screenplay was written by two brothers, Tony and Joe. To prepare for his role, Dwayne Jonson even took extreme driving courses. He was immediately drawn to the story and fully committed himself to the character.